Welcome to the Business of Race podcast, where we discuss issues of race and racism, how they impact business, and what organizations can do to effectively address them in order to create a healthy work environment for everyone. I'm your host, Regina Newkirk-Rucci, and today we are joined in the conference room by the illustrious, the magnetic, and the fantastic Dr. Tammy Hodo of All Things Diverse. Welcome to the conference room.
Thank you so much, Regina. I just love that introduction. I'm going to have to use that myself.
You know, when the adjectives apply, you have to pull them out. Well, you know, we could talk about a number of things all day long, but I'm going to make sure we get to our first agenda topic and get right down to business. And I want to talk about this issue of implicit bias, because I think a lot of times right now we're in an environment where people are really focused on racism, right? Mm-hmm. And not wanting to be seen as a racist. And while I think there's definitely issues of race and racism that in workplaces that have to be addressed, I think a far more prevalent one that often gets overlooked is the one of implicit bias. And because implicit bias applies to all of us. So I know this is your field of expertise. These are the trainings that you do. First of all, let's start with, what is implicit bias?
Implicit bias is unconscious. And what it is that our brain has developed a mechanism we've created a shortcut basically in our brain because we're exposed to so much stimuli. So implicit bias is where we want to place people, places, and things into categories. And it's unconscious. We're not necessarily knowledgeable that this is taking place, but it's a shortcut that our brain has developed in order to help us process all the stimuli we're exposed to daily. And so when we see people, places, or things, we place them into categories. So if we think about, you know, and I would be aging myself with this, but if you think about the skit in Saturday Night Live about Pat, mm-hmm. and the whole skit about Pat was that you did not know what sex Pat was.
Right.
That does not sit well with the brain mm-hmm. because we need to place people, places, and things into categories.
Right.
And so it's that unconscious bias, not knowing, and really it's part of our second nature mm-hmm. and it's that shortcut. But it creates a lot of issues in the workplace because oftentimes it's reliant upon oversimplified stereotypes that are not accurate.
Right.
So we get these biases, though, through our 4 major units of socialization. So your family, your peers, school, and the media. Mm-hmm. And so when you think about your upbringing and the community that you were brought up in, things that you see on television, those, even though we're not aware, are importing those biases into us.
Right.
So again, bias is unconscious, is implicit. It's not explicit. Mm-hmm. Explicit, I know I'm operating directly in that realm and mm-hmm. it's intentional, mm-hmm. but implicit is unconscious and I'm not aware of it, but it's that second nature.
And it's still happening. Even though you're not aware of it, you're still making judgment calls, categorizations of groups of people, all of those things based on, like you said, those 4 groups.
Exactly. And it's very problematic because what happens in the workplace is there are a variety of biases that we know happen in the workplace and the top 10 prevalent ones. But I'll just mention a few of them. Number 1 is affinity bias. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we tend to hire and promote people who we identify with. Mm-hmm. And we even see this in the criminal justice system. There have been studies that have been done where if a judge or a jury is sentencing a defendant, if they can identify with them and say, well, that could be my sister, my niece, my mom, a cousin, they tend to show more mercy versus someone they cannot identify with.
Right.
And that's affinity bias. And we see it in the workplace all the time where people may not be the best qualified for a promotion, but because the supervisor can identify with them better and, they feel that, well, they'll do a better job because they identify with them. That's part of that affinity bias. And we see it in the hiring process as well.
And that even those small things that sort of lead up to those hiring decisions, right? Like, I'm going to ask this person to go play golf with me, where I get to know them better, that affinity bias. I'm more likely to do that with somebody who looks like me, who has my background, who I connect with, right? Or we're building XYZ committee, we should ask so-and-so to be on it. And those opportunities that give you that leg up in the hiring process, those even can be impacted by implicit bias.
Oh, exactly. And you're spot on, because what we see happen, like explicitly, if I were hiring, maybe I would do more background checks on an African-American male. Implicitly, I would still do the same thing. I would do more background checks, but I wouldn't equate it to just him being African American. I just want to make sure he's a good cultural fit.
Right.
And that's the word that we often hear, cultural fit. But reality is in our society, it's very much still dominated by this Eurocentric ideology of what is adequate and what is relevant and what is success, and which doesn't leave a lot of room for people with that beautiful melanated skin,
right,
to make progress in a lot of organizations. And we see that with women in the workplace as well. If you look at Fortune 500 companies, I think right now we have 41 women leading Fortune 500 companies, and I think 3 are women of color. So we could talk about intersectionality, but again, it's doing those additional checks on people that you don't necessarily identify with, because you want to make sure that they're truly qualified, although they've made it, to the 3rd or 4th round.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about this in terms of organizations. I mean, that's what we're doing here on the Business of Race podcast. We said implicit bias applies to everyone, right? It applies to you and me just like it applies to everyone else. So if I am leading an organization, I always like to start with self, right? What do you say is the first thing you should do? I want to really be aware of how implicit bias might be impacting my decision making at my organization. What would you suggest to a business leader? What's the first thing they should do?
Well, you're going to have to learn what your biases are. And there are several ways that you can do that. But Harvard and the University of Virginia have created an implicit association test. And it's based off of speed. And that's because implicit bias, unconscious bias, is second nature. It's that automatic response. And so I would recommend, and they have a variety of tests. They have ones based on that social construct of race. They have one based on skin tone, as well as gender and career field, religion, and a variety of tests. But I would go and take some of those and begin to understand what some of your biases are. People often don't like the results of the test and they will question the validity. But they collect the data in aggregate form. So it's not like they're collecting your name or your email, or they're going to out you as someone who has this particular bias, but it will help you begin to understand what biases you potentially have. Another mechanism that you could use is begin to really do the self-examination. And so when I'm with a particular group of people, do I find that I'm less talkative? Do I find that I cut them off in mid-sentence? Do I find that I'm not as engaging, or I don't feel as comfortable? Maybe I have a bias towards those people.
Right.
So you have to really do that self-reflection, and the work is on you in order to make that happen. So I'll share some of mine. So I am a proud product of a inter-ethnic marriage. My parents married in 1962. My father, who has since passed, was African American, and my mother is German, English, and Welsh, and Jewish. So she's blonde hair, blue-eyed. When I took the test, right, and remember, at those 4 units of socializations, I grew up in a German enclave. In a highly segregated city, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But when I took it based off that social construct of race, it said that I had a slight preference for European Americans over African Americans. In America, the one drop rule is real. And I recognize that I am perceived and identified by a lot of Americans as African American, married to an African American, have an African American son. So why would I have that bias? Well, it makes sense to me because when I look at the community I was brought up in, the schools I went to were predominantly European American. My teachers were. When I think about the media depiction of the group that I belong to, it's not necessarily positive, particularly African American males, and so when I think about all of that, it makes sense to me why I have that bias. But what can I do to disrupt that bias or mitigate it is that I have to be cognizant of it, first of all. And then when I engage with people in my own community, I have to sit back and take a moment and think before I automatically respond.
Right.
I have to process that because I want to make sure I'm not imposing my bias onto them.
Right. And I think, taking the test is so enlightening. I really expected that I would have a preference toward white Americans, and I didn't. But then again, thinking about my family really sort of preaching a lot of Black pride and Black love and really showcasing the greatness and the strengths in the Black community. That was something I heard day in, day out, as well as lots of times when we got those messages in media, we had discussions about them in my household. My parents made sure I read books that had a lot of positive, African-American characters. So that was something that was very intentionally done that shifted me. However, when I took the skin tone one, right, I had found out that I have a bias for lighter skinned people, which kind of infuriated me a little bit as a darker skinned person. But then realizing that what is constantly the message that is enforced as far as beauty in particularly in the Black community is light skinned, right? Especially for women. So I understood that, but that's something that I really have to consciously work against to make sure that that isn't causing that disruption. So I think sometimes I'm really encouraging people to take the test because it really has some enlightening surprises, or it can in that process.
It really does. And I mean, and you think about the media, right? And for so long, if you look at how they've depicted beauty, it's very much based on this Eurocentric ideology. And then if and when people of color were perceived as beautiful, they were often light, Vanessa Williams,
Right.
Halle Berry. You think of that. And so when I took the test based on color, skin tone, I had the exact same results. I am the darkest of my parents' 3 children, and I'm the only one without green eyes. But I'm married to an African American, and my father had a beautiful dark complexion. So I was surprised that I had that bias as well, because I've always been told, the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. And very much in my household brought up with the ideology, my mom instilled in us, African American women don't need makeup. They're just beautiful the way they are. All these really just positive affirmations on a daily basis, but still, having that bias and having to check that.
Right. And that's the other thing, right? We start talking about bias. Certainly race is a part of that, but there are all of these components that go with it and the intersectionality of those things. So there's race, but there's also colorism. Then there's gender, there's sexual and sexual identity and gender identity. There's weight is a huge one. Weight and size. And then when those things merge, right? Because my brother talks about the fact that he's perceived so differently because he is a Black man who is tall and very large, right? Those things work together also in the bias. So really being aware of what those bias areas are and the fact that they intersect together and then create additional bias.
And they really do. And one of my major issues with what you just said, I agree with you wholeheartedly, is that I see African American men who are larger and who are darker, who have learned how to navigate in the space when they enter a room to make others feel comfortable. And that is very problematic for me because I know growing up in the community that I did, that oftentimes larger European American men don't have to contend with that.
Right.
And just the fear factor that is imposed on African American men if they're tall and they're dark and they're larger. I mean, we've seen that though in cases. I remember with the Mike Brown shooting, the officer said, well, he hulked up on me. Or we can think of George Floyd. I mean, we continuously see that, and we see it play out in society. And, this is a conversation I'm not proud, that I had with my son and my husband, is that my son is lighter, and I told him, you may be granted a little mercy, if and when you are stopped, and that's sad, but that is the reality. But I still need to train you how to behave when you are stopped, because the assumption is, versus my father, who had beautiful dark complexion and was 6'2", and the reality of how he would be perceived was going to be very different than how my son was perceived.
Right. Well, even in criminal justice system, it's shown that the darker you are, the more likely you are to get more years added to your sentencing for the exact same crime, right? So, and this is nothing but implicit bias, but we have all of these messages that reinforce these things coming at us from a variety of areas that we're not even necessarily aware of. And I think particularly now as we talk about social media and the fact that we are living in a time where people have more access to information than they ever have before in human history. And your brain has to have some way to try to process and categorize all that and make sense of it all. And this is where the implicit bias comes from.
Well, I mean, we can think about with O.J. Simpson. You recall how they darkened him up, on I think it was Time magazine. And that was intentional. We've seen that, and we've also seen where they've lightened other people.
Right.
So the media again is one of the major units of socialization, and it definitely, unbeknownst to us, imports those biases into us. And that factors in with all that intersectionality that we're already dealing with in a society that was really built off systemic racism. And that was something even during slavery, right? If you were fair, then you typically were in the house, but you were also probably a product of rape, but if you were darker, then you were out in the field, and it was a way to separate and segregate us and to create that colorism that we continue to see play out today.
Right. Even in the situation with Rwanda, it was an artificial separation of groups based on European features.
Exactly.
And those with European features were given better positions of power. So we sort of see this play out throughout the world.
Right.
We talk about skin lightening creams are one of the largest beauty industry products in the world. It's amazing. Billions of dollars.
In India. In India. I mean, and like you said, skin tone has a lot. It's colonialism.
Right.
It's this ideology of what's perceived as beautiful. And it's always amazing to me because if we look at it from a global perspective, Europeans are really the minority. They're not the majority.
Right.
But the impact that colonialism has had on the global society is continuing. We continue to see that impact. Billions of dollars spent on whitening cream. We see our Asian brothers and sisters having surgery to change the structure of their eyes, to the shape. And that is so problematic because I look and I'm just thinking, gosh, so many people are beautiful in their own right, but they don't realize it because they've internalized these messages of implicit bias that, the fairer you are, the more beautiful you are. And that's just not true.
Right. So we've been talking about a lot of these areas, and a lot of them I think people would put in the category of, that's social, that's just the community, the way of the world, these sort of broader topics. I'm talking about what's happening in my business, in my office, right? So number one, where are some of those places where implicit bias really impacts business? And then number two, what can businesses do to try to address it?
Well, number one, it impacts business in regards to who you're hiring and who you're promoting and who you're retaining. because that affinity bias is very real. And another bias that's real is performance. So if we see that, I'm in a predominantly female job market, I'm in a predominantly female career field, and I have a male. I may judge when it comes to performance, I may judge the females on potential, where that one male I have, I would judge on actual performance, which is not equitable and not fair to him.
Well, and I had a situation, where, okay, males in this field were doing the same, or were addressing issues in a way that was assertive, whereas I would address it and then I was aggressive. I did the exact same thing that he did. But then you get to the perceptions, those implicit biases as far as how women should behave and how men should behave. And so that can also enter into it, where you are making a judgment about behavior that is exactly the same, but you're putting a different value on it based on who it is that's, doing that action.
And then if we add a little melanin in there, you're angry.
Right.
And our Latina sisters, then they're feisty.
Right.
And so we see that play out. But we also see implicit bias in the workplace in regards to who even gets an interview. Oftentimes we see people who have ethnic names, don't even get interviews, although they're qualified or overly qualified for a position. And that's that bias, or we're doing more reference checks. On particular people. So this is impacting business, that, and reality is that with diversity comes innovation. And we've seen companies that have flourished and done extremely well because they've embraced and acknowledged and worked to dismantle a lot of the bias and the systemic issues, where we've seen other companies that continue to make errors. I remember the H&M ad where they had the young man that said, his shirt said wildest monkey or coolest monkey in the jungle.
Right.
And it was like, so first of all, I know you had no diversity at that table. Second of all, if you did, it was not inclusion, because inclusion is different. Not only do I have a seat at the table, but what I have to say is considered in the decision-making process.
Everybody doesn't have that at the table, but then how do you create those opportunities for discussion? How do you create those opportunities for knowledge building? How do you create those opportunities for exposure so that people's bandwidth is a little broader? They are better able to see their own biases and really actively work on addressing them.
So one of my top recommendations always when I teach about implicit bias is engage with people who are not like you, who have different sexual orientations, political and religious ideologies, different ethnicities, social economic status, educational levels, because what you're going to find is you have more commonality than you do differences, but then you actually have friends, right? People that, and I'm not talking about someone you go to lunch with. I'm talking about someone you invite to your home.
Right.
Because there's a difference. Yeah, I can go to lunch with a variety of people, but who I consider, within my friend group would be different, and so my friend group is very diverse, and it's intentional because I learn from other people, and that's what we do. But we also need to think about it, from their vantage point. So if I commit a bias and I say something that's out of line or offensive to someone, I want to have that vulnerability-based trust with that person where they could say, hey, Tammy, when you said this, it made me feel this way. And what I should not do is get offended or shut down. I need to look at it from their vantage point. I need to listen to what they say, and I need to do better. I need to be held accountable. And it's not, but the point is people have to do that. You have to know how to work and maneuver in that space. And so we don't want to call people out in front of others because then they shut down and they become confrontational,
Right.
But we have to create those relationships where it is vulnerability based, and someone can come to me after and say, hey, Tammy, and pull me aside. When you said this, it made me feel. And again, I need to listen to it and look at it from their vantage point and understand it and not make that mistake again. I can't tell someone how to feel, and if they felt that way, that's real.
Right.
And I don't want to impose my biases upon others. So again, knowing what some of my biases are and working through them, and that self-awareness and self-regulation, is imperative.
Well, and I also think that just knowing more people gives you more context. I don't have to rely on stereotypes, which truthfully a lot of implicit bias is based on, right? Again, it's those categorizations that your brain automatically makes. And so you've got these stereotypes going into that. You know, I remember when there were lots of arguments in North Carolina with gender neutral bathrooms and that sort of thing. And I would have conversations with people and I would say, how many transgender people do you know? And I don't know any. Okay, so everything that you're thinking about that might happen in this situation is then based on a stereotype, not actual knowledge, not anybody you've actually talked to and really have a deeper comprehension of what's going on and what's happening. And so there is real advantage in broadening that circle so that you aren't reliant on stereotypes and lean more heavily into these implicit biases.
I agree. And I would hate to tell people, but you have been in the restroom with someone who's transgender. You just don't know it, you know? And I mean, and the reality is that that's how that person identifies. That's their authentic self.
Right.
And that is just fine.
Right.
You know, and so when I heard all the talk about, well, they're pedophiles and this and that, it was disgusting to me because statistically, I know that heterosexual males are more prone to be pedophiles, you know, so it was just like the whole dialogue was incorrect.
I also had questions about what is happening in the bathrooms I go into a stall, I'm by myself, I take care of business, I come out, wash my hands, and then I'm on my way. Like I didn't understand, but if I don't have the information, I don't have the exposure, I'm getting fed things that bleed into fears and play into stereotypes, then you wind up with people having feelings and results that mirror exactly what we saw. Right.
And that's true. And I'll give you an example. So one of my really good friends, French Canadian. So when we still have this opioid epidemic, you know, that needs to be addressed. And she and I are out one night and we're friends. Like I go to her house, she comes to my house, you know, we're really good friends. And I said, you know, I have such a problem with this because when it was crack, it was, well, let's build more prisons, but the demographic looked differently, right? And she made a valid point. She said, Tammy, you have to understand. She said doctors were prescribing the pills. You know, and there were pill mills that were giving them the opioids, and that's how they became addicted. Where using crack was really an option, and she was and she was right in that. And so she was like, so that's why they're talking about rehabilitation. But initially, I didn't feel that way. You know, I felt some type of way, like, oh, when it's African Americans, because we know 1 out of 3 African American men will be under the control of the criminal justice system at some point. You know, and a lot of that has to do with bias, right? But I thought that was a valid thing that she brought up and something I had not thought of, you know, because it's like, you're right, though. The doctors did create this epidemic. And so, yes, we should look at rehabilitation, you know, but that's just like I think of marijuana. Now, all these states are making it legal, whether it be medicinal or recreational. Well, then we need to go ahead and do something in the criminal justice system, you know, because I know there are over 2 million people incarcerated. Over 1 million of them are Black and brown, and over 50% of them are there for nonviolent drug use. You know,
which is considered a felony, which then prevents you from getting a lot of other opportunities once you're a returning citizen. Absolutely.
Exactly. Right. You know, even the right to vote. Right. So we had Amendment 4, which I worked on here, you know, with some colleagues and Desmond Meade and all that to get it on the ballot. Florida said, yes, give them the right to vote back.
Right. Tammy, you know, this has been a wonderful and such an enlightening conversation. Thank you so much for joining us in the conference room today. We know we'll have you back. You've just been fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you for the invite, Regina. I really enjoyed it.
All right. And thank you for joining us today in the conference room for the Business of Race podcast. If you want to find out what's happening, please click the subscribe button below to get updated on all of our new content, and give us a thumbs up, like us, so that we know that we are really meeting the needs that you have out there in the community. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week in the conference room.